For more than 2000 years, Western philosophy has tried to find enduring structures beyond appearances. Name any of the great philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Kant, all of them have focused on permanence, stability, and in some ways stasis. But there is a really important and prolific Western philosopher working today who argues that thereby we have missed the constant flux that is at the heart of the universe. The cosmos is really animated by motion rather than stability. His work has ranged from politics to aesthetics to ontology, and he kind of premises a sort of historical ontology of matter, but at the same time, he argues that beneath all these different domains, motion or movement reigns supreme. In this interview segment of Anticlockwise, we are really proud and happy to have Professor Thomas Nail, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Denver, but more importantly, he is the architect of the philosophy of movement. And he has almost single handedly revived the study of Lucretius in the 21st century and in some ways redefined the works of Karl Marx as well as more recently Virginia Woolf. So, without further ado, let's go to Thomas and hear why motion is so central for understanding our chaotic digital age as well as for re-evaluating the entire tradition of Western philosophy.
So your most foundational work, at least in my reading, Being in Motion, overturns traditional metaphysics by asserting that motion, or what you call kinos, is primary rather than derivative of stable categories like space and time, which are often also understood as a priori categories. So, especially in Western philosophy. So, how does this core kind of ontological claim, where you prioritize motion, then translate into your other works in philosophy, your political work on kinopolitics, or the idea of the Kinocene and so on? So, how do your work, which is so wide-ranging, interconnect through the idea of the motion? If you could talk a little bit on that.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to participate in your podcast. Yeah, thanks for taking the time to read my work and ask these questions. To the point of how the idea intersects, let me just qualify. The claim is that I'm making is not that motion is absolutely fundamental. That just on its own is a kind of metaphysical claim. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. My claim is just it is that claim, but it's historical, meaning that maybe we're wrong. As far as we know, experimentally through observation, there's nothing in this cosmos that we have found that doesn't move. So motion seems like a pretty safe starting point. It's the thing that everything is doing. But also it's a historical claim based on experiment and observation. So although I'm a philosopher, my philosophical claims are still, responsive to history and to science and demonstration. And, so it's possible that I'm wrong. So far, not, but we'll see how it goes. So that's the context of making the claim that everything is in motion is just a descriptive claim so far about this cosmos. To the second question of how that relates, for those of you not familiar with my work, this is a very big question that I'll do my best to give a short answer, but I've spent about 10 years writing 12 books or so just on this topic, which is if we start philosophical thinking from movement, how does that change how we think about everything else? So I can't really synthesize that many books in a short answer. I'll just say that my own entry into this way of thinking started around 2009, 2010, when I worked with the migrant justice group known as Illegal in Toronto. I was writing a dissertation in political theory, thinking about the history of migration, thinking a lot about movement, and then tracing that far back into intellectual history, into world history of migration, and started to pick up on some patterns that ended up becoming quite significant. The first one being in Aristotle. In his Politics, he's pretty straightforward that he connects the idea that there's an unmoved mover at the center of the cosmos that doesn't move, but that sort of gives direction to the cosmos so that it unfolds in a good way and not in a bad way. And but he connects this with the political theory that what he calls barbarians, which is just anybody who doesn't speak Greek, those barbarians are in some ways not even capable of politics, of being political animals, because they lack Greek speech, the logos, which is the only speech capable of reasoned speech. So they can't be reasonable, and they're moving around too much. So they don't have a polis, and the polis is the Greek city. So they don't have that city. They don't have a kind of unmoved mover. They don't have a central point where they stay. He says they're always moving around too much, so they can't possibly be political. So this triggered for me. I was like, wow, that seems like a pretty deep, his view of the cosmos and his political view really seem quite aligned here in a way that I wonder if this actually holds true uh, across larger periods of time and other thinkers. And long story short, it does. And that commitment, and it's not a universal commitment, has nothing to do with universal humanity. At some point in time, in a certain place in the world, this idea comes into being, and it organizes a political reality, a scientific reality, an aesthetic reality, art and architecture, and yeah, and of course the history of ontology are all kind of organized around a very what I call like a kinophobia, that I thought for sure there'd be more exceptions to this, but inside of the Euro-Western tradition that I was studying with sort of Greeks forward, there really is this fear about movement, like obviously a curiosity and interest, but always how do we explain it by something that's going to give us more certainty, that gives us more knowledge, something that's a foundational. Archimedes, Descartes, Einstein, they wanted something that was fixed and still and static to build everything else on. You get certain knowledge. And that just never worked out. It never manifested. So after the long history of that, we are now in a position to look back and say, that was an interesting obsession in the history of Euro-Western, and I mean other cultures too, but in this case, intense focus from all of the greatest thinkers inside that Euro-Western tradition. And so my question is, why were they so obsessed with explaining away movement? And who are the people who didn't during that time and that geography? And my latest work is exploring everything that happened before then, which is a quite different story. I'll end there.
Yeah, that's really so fascinating. So it gives me it triggers multiple questions in me. So my first follow-up question would be how do you define the historical ontology, and how is it different from history per se? Because and also ontology. Especially, I'm thinking of how, historians define specific periods and transitions, even though they tend to critique teleology a lot now, there is a certain sense that certain forms develop and evolve and kind of reach its peak at some period. So this is feudalism, and then it's declining, mercantile capitalism going into industrial capitalism, etc. So how does that kind of a historical approach is similar to what you are calling historical ontology, or whether it's similar to it?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the two terms are history and ontology. What I'm doing is slightly different than history. If, and not all historians, of course, accept the same methodology, but if we are thinking of history as a historian from the present or something is looking back on the past from some kind of neutral position to describe things that happened in the past in some objective or just, let's say, qualified a way that is, they're doing their best to give an account, a kind of a quasi-realism, historical realism. It's not that kind of history because the tricky thing is that when we're telling the histories, it's sort of like nested Russian dolls, if you know what I mean. Like every period of time has its historians who are giving historical accounts, both of themselves and of the past. And the way that they look at the past is informed by where they are at that moment. And so this is an interesting way to look at different periods of history, the way that the historians themselves are sort of invested in those things. and shape those things. In other words, in the present, we are involved in shaping and making reality. Whether that it's not just talking about linguistic constructivism, I mean like a real kind of practical shaping of the globe and art and architecture and science and everything. And history is part of that. It's both making the world and then describing that world. But you can see that it's because it's also making it at the same time as it's describing it. It has a different status than, like, we're not neutral observers from outside. We're very much involved in it, making it, shaping it. And we do the same thing when we look back at history, is we make and shape that history and retell it in such a way that is related to our own. Okay, sorry for that long digression, but the point about the way that I've done history here is to ask how it is that our condition, and I'm saying the more general condition here for our moment, is movement, meaning that as far as we know now, okay, this is a contra Aristotle. What we know now, given physics, the state of physics and science, is that everything is in motion. So let's start there. And I'm just trying to be transparent about the historical condition here. Now, there's more than just that, but that's like a deep starting ontology of this historical condition. Is right now we don't know of anything that's not in motion. So let's start there and then give a description. And this description is like, you can see I'm trying to basically admit the influence on my own history of the present moment. So the way the contemporary world shapes and produces me, the historian, and other historians as well, is influenced by, as you said, a long history, but also the current one of, the Anthropocene, global capitalism, certain forms of digital aesthetics, and all these other things that go into shaping it. So in several of my books, I tried to like outline what are these big sort of, big events of our time that go into shaping that. Okay, that's just to say that's where history starts, is in the present. And trying to understand what is it that's shaping the historian to give an account of the past. And I try to just say as much of that as I can that goes into my own being shaped by the historical present. Okay, so that makes it in some ways maybe not quite neutral history. The other is ontology, which again, in a very naive sense, just means describing the nature of things, just being. What's it like out there? And in the tradition of philosophy, philosophers sit around and think real hard, and then come up with the nature of reality. And this is not what I'm doing. I'm not just giving some account of reality. As I said, it's a historical ontology, meaning I'm giving an account of reality as we know it from the present moment, given the things that we know right now and all the things going on that influence that way of knowing. So it's contextual, it's situated, to some degree. And then from that perspective, we can look back at all of these older historical moments where philosophers of those time periods, so ancient and medieval and modern and so on, we can look and see that actually, although they never really said this, they were doing the same thing, which is they lived in a present moment shaped by realities that actually produced the way that they were able to think about that reality that they were in. So they produced all of them historical ontologies, even though they're not saying, here's my historical ontology. They're just saying, I thought real hard, and here are the mechanisms I have. I've got books, I've got tablets, I have, the printing press. What do I have to assemble? How did thinking happen? Did it happen with a pen? Did it happen through, cuneiform? So I look at all the material aspects of their world, art and architecture and writing instruments and all the technologies that go into thinking. So this idea that philosophy is like outside of space and time and thought can just exist transversely across all time. No, it's always historically situated. So how are the technologies of those time periods, the worlds of those time periods, producing a way of thinking that expresses itself in the descriptions of the nature of reality? And that sounds like really big. I mean, I'm not sure if we could go back to the Aristotle example, and then I'll just leave it at that. The Aristotle example would be, Aristotle has that image of an unmoved mover. It comes out of a very particular kind of historical, geographical time period and architecture. This idea of a kind of center of the Greek city-state. Okay, so prior to that, I mean, the archaic Greek world is so different than the classical Greek world that Aristotle's living in. Aristotle's inhabiting a very particular classical Greek world where there is this kind of center city-state, and it has fixed laws and a constitution, and it has all of these things that Aristotle says it does. And the image of a kind of center point of a temple, of a city center, that and a set of laws and a set of citizens and a kind of universality inside of that world. Now, granted, it's a pretty limited universality historically, but okay, for Aristotle, he believes it's legitimate, and it's anyway, that idea of a center, it is an image that spans across other dimensions of Greek society. That I really can't go into right now. I'll just say, but the image of a center and a periphery, that kind of image of a central unmoved mover and a world that the unmoved mover creates, that in some ways his ontology resonates with his political context and aesthetic and scientific, but I don't have time to go into those. I'll just say that you can look even at the sort of city planning and architecture just to get a resonance that his thought about the world was in some ways an iteration, an expression of his historical, geographical world. It produced him, his body, his mind, his artifacts and techniques of writing and recording and reading to produce the ontology that he had. But he was not fully conscious in that same way of all of those things that go into that. He really thought, I thought real hard and I'm getting to the nature of things. And I'm not looking at it from that perspective.
Yeah, it definitely reminded me of Hegel as well, because he's kind of thinking of all these histories that have happened and that are kind of within philosophy, and then trying to find as if a perch which is not historical. But what he was saying is, like, you can never find that kind of a still center, if I'm understanding it correctly, like the Descartes' cogito, or Hegel's idea of finding this kind of stillness. So there is a lot of food for thought. Thanks for that really comprehensive explanation. So if movement has always shaped, human social forms, technologies, and architecture, and all of that, cultural forms that you were talking about. But then there is also a huge focus on the non-human in your work. So our current geological epoch, where human beings become kind of geological agents, and you call it Kinocene, which is specifically marked by this non-human movement. So is there anything exceptional to our moment of anthropogenic climate change, or has it been the characteristic of human history all through, and we are only recognizing it now? Because there is a debate, especially among historians, whether is it a different period of history. So Dipesh Chakraborty's four thesis of history, he talks about how now there is kind of a divergence between history and something which is kind of historically changing but cannot be subsumed within a human idea of history. So how does kind of our present age accentuate or differs from these previous eras, which have defined by motion and change? But yeah.
Yeah, so ours, yeah, that's basically right. All of Earth's history is defined by movement. Again, it's a kind of historical ontological claim. Everything's always been moving. Nothing has ever been static. So all of Earth's history is also moving. But there is something also special about the present moment under the contemporary context, is that there's no stage in Earth's history where this much stuff is moving around as quickly and as in the same amount of mass as it is now. I'm talking about everything, all the materiality dug up out of the bowels of the earth and just spread across the whole, planet. I mean, the world of massive shipping and transportation, of airliners, and that world. I mean, there are pretty intense periods of geological history, but none of them where the animals. So right now, more than half of the world's plants and animals are in migration. They're moving. Now, in other periods of time, there's maybe been, less animals, but I mean, and insects and things like. So, given how many we have, they are just everybody else. Humans are moving, plants are moving, animals are moving. Just if we think about metal and material, or like chicken bones or styrofoam all over the planet, it's a lot of movement of things relative to the surface of the planet. If we thought about human beings as a kind of, and their metal and their plastics and all the stuff they dug up out of the earth, if we thought about that as a kind of, which it's a geological layer that's been ripped out and then thrown around the whole planet, and including out into orbit around the planet. There's like, it's not exactly a geological strata, but it's a weird thing where like you've got chunks of the geological strata melted down into alloys, and then through various rockets into space, we have space debris, just, hundreds and thousands of pieces of space debris floating around the planet. I mean, that's crazy on its own. So there is something about the present moment in which we can think about a very weird, or even just how much microplastics, a credit card's worth a week of microplastics we're digesting. I mean, it's a very weird idea that we've got like, sedimented plant and dinosaur, bones and flesh melted down into plastic that we digest on a weekly basis. That's a very weird geological situation. So anyway, that's why I call it the Kinocene, is just because we're in an age of unprecedented kind of geological mobility. Not necessarily like, I mean, plate tectonics, nothing has significantly changed, but just all the examples I gave of those strata being ripped out and then circulated, that's new. So that is a time to call attention to the fact that movement has always been primary. So then we can look back and try to understand our present moment as within a larger Earth history trajectory. What does it mean now in an Earth that things are always moving around, for us to move them around in this way at this intensity? And I don't have time to summarize the entire book, Theory of the Earth, but the short of it is, yeah, I mean, it's not a good situation. And the really short, I guess, would be that humans, some of them obviously, have reduced planetary entropy. This is the final chapter of the book where all this is calculated, the energy levels. We've reduced planetary entropy by half, by basically destroying half the trees on the planet since the Holocene. From 6 trillion, now we're at 3 trillion. Trees are a pretty big part of what keeps energy moving from the sun through the planet, radiated out into space as thermal heat. That that is the regulatory system that maintains Earth's stability. And what we've essentially done is slowed that down. So yes, we've slowed it down by fossil fuels and deforestation, but it's not so much the emissions themselves that are, I think, the main problem, although obviously fossil fuels are a major problem. It's really that we have increased the heat at rapidly enough that it destroys enough animals, plants, and mainly trees that have destabilized. Okay, here's an example. You have water moving along the bathtub and then spiraling down the drain. That's the energy flow from the sun. The spiral is the earth. Out the drain is into space. If you slow that water down, like if you got your hands and slowed the water down, that spiral, that metastable state, is going to slow down and it's going to dissolve, and it won't be a spiral. Spirals are very efficient at degrading and breaking down and dissipating energy. But if you slow them down, or if you speed them up and put too much water, it will destroy the whole thing. So we're in that situation now, which is we have essentially slowed down the process by which energy from the sun is transformed through transpiration in trees and radiated out as heat. I mean, it gets consumed by all kinds of other creatures before it goes into space, but that's a big regulatory part of sustaining the temperature and the climate of this planet. So yeah, there's a whole list in the book, but I mean, one of the main things that we could actually do is plant at least 1 trillion trees. And there was a whole campaign to do it, and it went terribly. So I don't endorse any of the plans so far as they've gone through to like plant that many trees, but there is enough space to do it. The logistics and politics of it seem so simple, but yet absolutely ruined by everybody who's tried to do it so far. So not encouraging.
Yeah, it reminded me of book called The Sky of Our Manufacture, which is this book on, how the Victorian sky is a manufactured sky. So how the sky is described in the writing of Dickens and one of your favorite writers, Virginia Woolf. It kind of shows that this sky is not similar to the sky that was just out there before. It's a sky that has absorbed the industrial smoke, and there is this whole kind of focus on smog in British literature from this kind of mid 19th century to mid 20th, and how what we think is just out there and natural is actually very much how you describe the dinosaur bones and all of that depositing within us. It reminded me of that. And also of a paper
Mm.
that I'm writing on oceanic currents and how, this idea of meteorology came into being when they started thinking of how to predict storms by compiling data from sailors' logbooks. Well, the storm is in itself something that kind of fundamentally disrupts any kind of regularity. So, how there is this
Mm.
tension between the regularizing kind of scientific mode and the irregularity of the matter that they're dealing with. And that kind of focuses on the what is at the center of maritime imperialism. So to kind of move on from there, how do you define your position as different from the other kinds of new materialism which are prevalent in critical theory and philosophy? So especially, vital materialism and object-oriented ontology. I can kind of sense how your idea of the matter is different, but could you elucidate that a bit for our audience?
Yeah, so I have like a 45-minute lecture that's just that. So I can't give that. I can't just go through all the thinkers, but I've done that in my books. Gosh, where even to start? I mean, I'll just start with the ones you mentioned. Object-oriented ontology is just not new materialism, so that one's easy. I mean, Graham Harman wrote a book called Immaterialism. He's not a materialist. It's always funny to me that people lump him into an OOO as it just shows that like I think a lot of people use these words new materialism and object oriented ontology as synonymous when they just fundamentally aren't. They're just not compatible philosophical systems at the ontological basis, and I think Harman would agree with that. But yeah, other people not so much. Vital materialism is closer to where I'm at. I just worry. I have like five different worries, but I'll just maybe share a couple worries about the vital part of that. To me, the vital doesn't really add anything to just materialism. To say that it's life, I mean, are you just saying like everything is life, and then at that point why are we even using this word? If it's you just mean everything, then just say everything. You don't need to add life to that. Not only does it not add anything as a helpful descriptor to thinking about matter, I find it's actually quite it has like a nasty history to it, and I recognize that Jane Bennett and others are not affirming this nasty history, but historically speaking, life is higher up on the great chain of being than, for example, death. And of course, vital new materialists say, oh, death is life too. Again, back to my point number one. If life is death, why are we even using this word? What are we getting out of it? If you just mean matter has agency, okay, I'm with you there. That sounds fine to me. So agential materialism with Karen Barad, I think is closer to where I'm at, because that to me, agency is a word that makes sense. It does add something, in part because people have thought matter doesn't have any kind of agency, but only really does it mean something to me in the context that Barad uses it, which is that for her, agency means indeterminacy. That the world, from the subatomic level to macroscopic levels, the cosmos and so on, has a real indeterminacy that is also relational. So relational, indeterminacy, those are key words that mean something. Life has too much metaphysical baggage for me. It doesn't add anything. it's got too much baggage. It's too high up on the great chain of being. Let's stay closer to the bottom, is my view, and just deal with matter. Um, Other types of new materialisms. I mean, I mean, those are maybe some of the bigger ones. We don't have time to go to the whole list. Maybe Kenton Meyasu is sometimes called a new materialist, but it's just always bought, like what he calls matter to me is absolutely non-relational because he thinks ultimately there's a hyper chaos, that being is just hyper chaos, meaning it's totally non-relational. And then things miraculously just pop out into existence. And so he has a famous essay of, that like where like God could come out of this. Like it's possible that there could be a God that's going to emerge from hyperchaos. To me, this just sounds like total nonsense, metaphysical stuff that philosophers have been way too attached to for too long. This is not, and none of it is verifiable with anything anyway. Like it's not something it's not falsifiable. Is there or is there not hyperchaos? Who cares? Like, you can't actually prove that, but you can't disprove it either. No one's ever observed. There's no evidence of hyperchaos. There are experimental evidence in quantum physics that involve indeterminacy, but indeterminacy is always relational. That's the whole point of the double slit experiment. It's an experiment. You can look at it, you can interpret it, you can come to different interpretations, but at least you're looking at an experiment. But this stuff about hyperchaos and producing God, to me, this is not serious, like historical, verifiable, or even falsifiable kinds of work. Maybe I'll just leave it there because we could just go on and on. I mean, Bergson is a bit more in the vitalist camp, although he has some passages that seem like he really thinks movement is primary, but then other places where he says it's the elan vital. Whitehead is really, although both Bergson and Whitehead are process philosophers, for Whitehead, and probably Whiteheadians disagree because they mostly disagree with even one another. It's hard to find Whiteheadians who agree with each other about many things because Whitehead's writings are very difficult to read. But with Whitehead and Harman, I agree with his reading on this point, is that for Whitehead, it's just like it's occasionalism. That Whitehead was an occasionalist, meaning that like the entire cosmos just flashes into existence and flashes out. But it's like a movie camera, it's like, old school films that are just run together really fast, and then that produces the process of reality. That's really the opposite of Bergson. Bergson explicitly says it's not like film. Okay, it's not like cinema. Reality is not discontinuous, just run together. It's totally continuous. So for Bergson, it's continuous. For Whitehead, it's discontinuous. For me, it's indeterminate. That's the
Okay.
shortest version I have of that.
Yeah, thanks for that. So now, could we talk a little bit about whom you think as your precursors in the philosophy of kinetic materialism or the process materialism? So you have written quite a bit on Lucretius, and also you have defined Marx in a way which is kind of quite distinctive, although people have talked about metabolism or metabolic rift and so on, but how you talk about metabolism is different. And in your recent work, Virginia Woolf, you mentioned the word metastable, which recurs a lot in your Woolf book, and Woolf has this idea of moments of being and so on. So could you talk about how these figures influence you and kind of the genealogy you trace of kinetic materialism?
Yeah, so this was the other project alongside just kind of inquiring into the Euro-Western tradition of ontology and science and art and politics. The other one was just to answer the question, is there anybody inside of that Euro-Western tradition that doesn't think that they can explain movement by something that is not movement? So people have tried to explain it away with space. No, space is more fundamental. No, time is more fundamental. No, eternal forms, mathematical laws, God, and all those things. Who is it inside that tradition that just said, no, you cannot explain it by anything else? You just have to assert what Lucretius, the first in this tradition, in this timeline, calls the swerve, which is, he says, it's just the indeterminate movement of matter. And he says it's always been in the habit of swerving. And if matter hadn't always been in the habit of swerving, then there'd be no world. Nothing would ever come to exist. matter has to always be swerving. And he says indeterminate time and indeterminate space, meaning that it's not happening in time or in space, but that the movement of matter is itself primary, is indeterminate, but then out of it, you get the emergent properties of space, time, patterns, and things that we attribute laws to, and so on. So really the three things that are common to all those three thinkers are indeterminacy, so ontological indeterminacy, relationality, that it's indeterminate, but it's also relational, which allows it to produce emergent patterns. And then the third one is processual patterns. And so just how things emerge and then hold together in a metastable way so that we see things around us and we say, oh, look, there's a thing, but it's a metastable process. Energy's coming in, it's cycling through, it's going out. All of it is indeterminate. But the indeterminacy stabilizes what physicists call decoherence, but it just means you get a kind of relative stability of things, even though really there's not any fixed stability at all. That's all there. I think Lucretius is the one that sort of brings that, emphasizes it in the ancient world, and Marx is the first one. Marx wrote his dissertation, so that's like my angle on reading Marx. So my book on Marx in Motion is the first book on Marx and new materialism, and that's just trying to put those pieces together. And the reason that I think many Marxists have had a very different view of Marx is because they don't read his dissertation, or if they do, they don't take it very seriously and they don't understand Lucretius. And what Marx was on about in Epicurus and Lucretius. And one of the key ideas there is the swerve. There's no way that you can get deterministic materialism or deterministic history from the swerve. You just can't. It just doesn't make any sense. And so when people try to read Marx in that way, it just doesn't mesh with his writings on Lucretius and the swerve. What he calls, a sort of imminent dialectics of where he's thinking the swerve as what gives dialectics, which is a very different way of thinking of dialectics, as being sort of, driven by this indeterminate movement of matter that Marx is never is going to explain away by anything else. So that puts him in this camp, and it makes Lucretius his, kind of historical predecessor in that way. And Virginia Woolf learned Latin by reading De Rerum Natura, Lucretius's, only that we have poem. She often talks about the swerve, and she's talking about matter. She doesn't accept the existence of God. She says that, when she has these moments of being, she writes about these in her unfinished autobiography, one of the last things she worked on before she died. She says, this is what all my writing has been about. It's always been about these moments of being. I've had them since childhood. In these moments, I see that everything is related. Everything is relational. There's no God. There's no other thing. There's just an imminent world that is highly patterned. So she says there's patterns beneath the cotton wool that show her how things are related. Really, I'll just give one last really beautiful image that she gives that I like a lot, is this image of the surface of the water, and there's these bobbers or corks floating on the water, and then beneath the water is like a fishing net. And so she says, like the image is of these, like we see the bobbers of reality, the things around us, but the net is what holds them all together. And that's beneath the surface. And that's what she sees when she has these moments of being. She also translated, and I have, collected from her library a bunch of parts where she translates Lucretius in three parts in particular. She doesn't translate all of his poem, but big chunks of it that all have to do with these sort of moments of epiphany. And it's those moments of epiphany that she shares with Lucretius, where she sees the world in this relational way, in an indeterminate way. In Mrs. Dalloway, she says that, she would never say of anyone that they were either this or that. And this image of not being able to say anything definite about the world, that nobody is this or nothing is that. She feels that the power of the indeterminacy, even if we're talking about matter at like a very fundamental level, it still trickles up. There still is residues and activity of indeterminacy at the macroscopic level. I'll just end there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It reminded me of this Wolf quote where kind of I don't know if it's from Mrs. Dalloway, maybe it's from her essay Modern Fiction, where she talks about life is a luminous, halo, kind of semi-transparent envelope that wraps us from the beginning of consciousness to the end. It's not a continuous kind of geek lamps, I think she calls continuous stream of light or
Hmm.
anything. But I find it fascinating how specifically you talk about this as indeterminate relationality of matter that kind of underlies our consciousness and our being, rather than as something which is just consciousness. So a lot of, I mean, that's the traditional understanding of Wolf, that she's this great, kind of um, stream of consciousness technique, and it's more kind of a different moments of memory or subjectivity that are put together. So as opposed to that, you were talking about a kind of material interrelation rather than subjective or kind of interrelation of memory. So could you talk a little bit on how she is more of a materialist and realist rather than subjectivist or a practitioner of interior monologues and so on?
Yeah, you're right. That is a common reading of Virginia Woolf is psychologistic and subjectivistic or even phenomenological. And I think that when you look at Woolf's quotes, that's she's explicit that's not what she thinks about her own work. Again, these moments of being are not psychological. She's really getting at reality. And you can disagree with her and say, no, she's not. She's having a manic depressive episode and it's completely reducible to her psychology. I mean, you can say that, but you're disagreeing with her about it, and that's fine. But we should be clear about what Woolf thought about these moments. And you can see that. I don't have all the quotes in front of me, but it's in my book on Woolf, all the quotes in a row where she says, she does not define herself. She knows what stream of consciousness is, and that's she says that's not what she's doing. And I think it's funny how much people think that she's doing stream of consciousness when she has passages where she says that's not how she thinks about her own work. Not because it's not true, but because that's not the point. The point is that everything is streaming. It's stream of reality. It's process philosophy. It's not just stream of consciousness. That is a very narrow constructivist reading that is possible, but it very much is tells you a lot about literary theory and the history of literary theory, or even just philosophical interpretation. That people's go-to way of thinking about things is constructivism. That humans construct the world through language and psychology and so on. But there's another book, and I'm forgetting the author at the moment, that wrote about Virginia Woolf and realism. But thinking about Virginia Woolf as a realist, not just as a realist author, but as a realist philosopher, that would be my contribution in this book, because I think Woolf scholars and people don't usually think about Woolf as a philosopher, even if they say she is very philosophical in her writings. They don't think of her as a philosopher. And I think that's interesting from a disciplinary perspective, why she can't be a philosopher. But in her unpublished, or unfinished autobiography, she says she has a philosophy. And I mean, again, we can say, no, you don't, Virginia Woolf. We denounce this as a philosophy. But she says she has a philosophy. I mean, that makes her a philosopher. Her philosopher in her own words, that in her own thinking, she thought that she had a philosophy. And I'm just trying to take that seriously, what it would mean to believe her that she was. Most of the work out there that's on Woolf and philosophy is like Virginia Woolf is like paired with some other, usually male philosopher, and then like, oh, it's a lot like what Nietzsche said, or it's a lot like what Bergson said, and it's like, well, that the only thing that makes her philosophical is that she said something that some other dude already said? Is that what is so like? I don't. That's not the method I've taken with this book. Is I really wanted to treat her work itself as philosophical. Um, and yeah, that's I think a contribution. But yeah, so I think she's a realist. I think she thinks she's a realist. All the quotes where she says that she's a realist, I've put in the book. So I think it's pretty clear that from her perspective, she thought she was basically giving a realist account of the world. And moments of being were not moments of psychological interior monologue. They were real access points for her to describe reality. And it's the other levels that are not the moments of non-being. Those are the moments that we often call sort of psychological or subjective. Those aren't moments of being.
Yeah, that makes sense. I often kind of pair Virginia Woolf with James Joyce, and I'm kind of curious. I cannot just control this curiosity to ask what you think of James Joyce because, I mean, his so-called stream of consciousness technique is more jagged and elliptical. If you're thinking of technique, it's not as smooth and as wave-like or interconnected as Woolf's, but it's more like the sea, and then there is some thought, and then there is some childhood memory streaming in. And Joyce is another writer who has been very much kind of interpreted in psychological, even psychoanalytic terms. So I had a kind of a phase where I was very invested in Lacanian psychoanalysis, and they kind of think of, oh, this is great writer who exemplifies psychosis in writing, etc. So, and yes, in fact, I mean, even Wolf scholars, they do talk about, and that's how a lot of literary scholars write, where they try to find kind of figural resonances uh, of a literary text with some philosophical thought, which is somehow different. So this is also an interconnected question about this kind of what you talk about, the disciplinary divide between art and philosophy, because you write about Lucretius, and I was taught Lucretius in an elective course as a poet. So how does this kind of famous division between art and philosophy, which can be traced as far back to Plato in Western philosophy, that still kind of impacts the writing of philosophy and the study of philosophy and art? And how do you see your work kind of doing with that division?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've repaired any divisions that have happened. I certainly, I don't know, express some dissatisfaction with them, and other people have too. I don't know if we'll ever get Humpty Dumpty back together again. I mean, I will say that to me, some the where my work is at now is looking at traditions, places in the world, and time periods prior to the invention of transcendence. And that means I'm looking at a lot of older mythologies like cosmogony, stories of the creation of the cosmos. And these texts are not they do not fit the categories of, I mean, they've got the modern category is mythology, which we don't even need to begin, but like that's such a problematic categorization but it's a place that like modern, like that it's got its own place because it can't reside in the proper domains of real Euro-Western knowledge, like what is the status of the Egyptian pyramid texts, for example, the oldest cosmogonies texts that are recorded on the planet. What is their status? Not really philosophy in any sense of the modern sense, but not exactly poetry. They're magic spells, So we're dealing with texts from these traditions that are songs, they're magic spells, they're chants, incantations, they're at the same time works of art. They're ontological descriptions. They are happening usually in some kind of social political context. And that they're really talking about reality. All of those things are together, and you can't separate them out. And I think that is one of the things that the Euro-Western tradition has inherited and struggles with, but have certainly not overcome, is just the division between those things. So how do we get them back together again? It's not just something of like we're waiting for the right theorist or the right artist or whatever to get these back together again. I mean, it's we're just dealing with a totally different world. I mean, the worlds prior to the beginnings of transcendence, uh, these kinds of distinctions weren't there, don't make sense. But in our world, those distinctions, they're almost inevitable that people will make them, that it's almost hard to write as if those aren't there. Even publishing, just the technical process of writing it, publishing it, how people will receive it, who receives it, all of these things, it's a very fraught situation. Obviously, but so for me, none of this stuff, science or art, none of it is off limits. Like all of it is engaged in a very similar kind of questioning about what's going on. I mean, just what's happening. And they're all getting at that. So anyway, you've asked a very big question, so I'm stumbling an answer through it. So maybe I'll just stop and say that um, I don't know what the future will look like for the relationship between art and philosophy. I will just say that the tension is remains, but it's a historical one, meaning it could be different. Okay, it's not fixed. Like the idea that somehow, and the battle between philosophy and art, so it goes back to in many ways Plato and ancient Greece. That's the first moment where philosophers come into existence. They have to define themselves by what they're not, and they say we're not the poets, we're not doing mythology. That's the moment philosophy has to say we're not doing art, because art is going to mislead you. And Plato says, of course, that this is like the worst situation. It's never ask questions about reality from artists or poets. They're going to give you all this nonsense about the gods. And I think that break is not just, it's not just one among others. It is fundamental to the entire tradition. The break is about transcendence. Before that, in Homer, you've got a world, an imminent world. The gods are not outside of this world. They're in it. They are it. Aphrodite is the waves. There's not the waves and then Aphrodite who lives on a mountain somewhere. They're just is the waves are her. They're imminent gods and they populate that world. But the moment where you introduce transcendence, and that can be the transcendence of the philosophers, the sort of celestial sphere and the cosmos and these laws, or elements in the abstract, like all of these abstract ideas that come out of the pre-Socratics and so on, it's all predicated on the erasure of the older traditions that preceded them, which are not just poetry, even though they are all poetry and art in this way. They are poetry and art that was also doing everything. So it's, anyway, gonna get started on this, but it's because it's a deep question. It really affects everything. The way that we even proceed to do things now, to break them up into pieces and then have disciplines and sub-disciplines, and then the disciplines can fight over, is Virginia Woolf a philosopher or a novelist or a poet? I mean, these kinds of debates, they make sense in our world, but but the questions themselves are much older and deeper. And in some ways, the decision about the status of philosophy and art is an old one. So yeah, I don't know what's going to happen moving forward, if that's your question. But
Yeah, no,
it's a
that
good
makes
question
sense.
to ask, and remember that that's the world we live in. Is these are separated things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It definitely reminded also of me of religion, which is also sometimes part of this kind of. So one of the professors of, Vaishnavism, he kind of ranted to me once that why is it always taught within the religious studies departments and not philosophy? So also it's like how certain non-Western philosophies or mythologies or religions, all of which are melded together, are kind of trifurcated into these three different pieces and then they're taught differently, which kind of then create certain realities, which, as you were saying, we are creating the reality as we are describing it. So kind of that made perfect sense.
Yeah,
Okay,
religion,
great.
that's religion is the other one that's like has to define itself as not being those older imminent worlds where everything is born out of chaos, and it's an imminent world. Religion is, but just on its study, which is a Euro-Western kind of invention, the study and nomenclature, and of course, as it appears now in disciplines, it doesn't it also had to define itself against mythology. But you're right, it ends up being taught sometimes in religious departments, or sometimes in philosophy, but just mostly not taught at all. So anyway, that's what I'm teaching right now. It's just mythology. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Thomas. I'll stop recording now.